Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final day of our roundtable series. This is entitled Investing in Change, Growing High Impact CDFIs of Color. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think that you're in for a very impactful couple of panels, and we'll give people maybe 30 more seconds to join before we move forward. Okay, so again, hello and welcome. Happy Wednesday, and thank you for joining us today for the final day of this roundtable series. Today's session is entitled Investing in Change, Growing High Impact CDFIs of Color. So just a few housekeeping tips. We will be interacting with you all a lot throughout this entire webinar. So please use the questions box to interact with us. You are muted to ensure our quality recording, but please talk to us. Use your control panel for GoToWebinar and just open up that questions box and feel free to drop any questions or comments. And we'll be sure to get those to our speakers in real time so that they can respond to you during today's webinar. And if you are experiencing any technical issues, please email us at gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. And here are just a few goals and guidelines for getting the most out of today's webinar. So we want to ensure that you join from a quiet place, get nice and cozy. I know that the temperature has dropped for a lot of us, so grab something warm to drink, grab a snack, and settle in. Also, again, engage with us. Use that questions box at any time to submit questions, comments, share your stories, and let us know a little bit more about your work. And also reflect on ways to apply what you learned today. Everything that we do here at Prosperity Now really is for our audience and our community. So we really hope that you get something out of today and that it really changes the way that you do your work for the better. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Ebony White.
All right. So thank you guys for being with us today. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Ebony White, Director of the Racial Economic Justice Team here at Prosperity Now. This is the last webinar, as Olivia mentioned, of a three-part roundtable discussion on building up Black-led CDFIs. The topic today is investing in change and how can we really work collectively to grow high-impact CDFIs of color. For those of you who are not maybe familiar with Prosperity Now, our mission is to drive economic opportunity for all and build equitable economic power. We create impactful systemic change by centering those who have been historically excluded, amplifying community-rooted solutions, and energizing them through research, advocacy, policy, and narrative change. The Racial Economic Justice Team brings, I'll say, some unique experience, strategies, practices, and knowledge rooted in racial economic equity to support how best to be in partnership with, in service to, in support of BIPOC leaders working to advance economic mobility and asset building strategies for those who are furthest from economic justice. We provide socioeconomic tailored technical assistance and catalyze their leadership through organizational management, service delivery, and their advocacy and policy efforts. Today's conversation is in support of our Building High Impact CDFIs of Color projects, where we have identified 10 Black-led CDFIs who are already doing great work and who are primed to scale their investments in communities of color. We know that strong community-based CDFIs are a cornerstone of any successful strategy to reduce racial economic inequality. And we also know that Black-led CDFIs are being asked to do a lot with not enough resources. By the end of this roundtable discussion, we hope that you will have a deeper understanding of what those racial economic inequalities are that Black-led CDFIs and their communities are experiencing. We want you to know some promising practices that will help promote a shift from transactional to transformational partnerships within the funding sector. We also want to explore some innovative ways to sustain and grow high-impact CDFIs as a step toward addressing the racial wealth divide. And we hope that with in partnership with all of you, that we are able to create some ideas that encourages some product innovation, and also that some ways in working that just provides more flexibility to our CDFIs. I also want to take this time to thank our partners and our co-hosts, Kaiser Permanente and the African American Alliance of Black CEOs. None of this would have been possible without you, and I look forward to building on our relationship. With that, I would like to invite Avital Aboudi with Kaiser to provide some more remarks on why this partnership and the work is so important to them. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Avital Aboudi, and I lead Kaiser Permanente's national strategy to promote the growth and sustainability of diverse-owned businesses. This work is part of Kaiser Permanente's community health department, which works at multiple levels to address social determinants of health, environmental justice, and access to housing and economic opportunity being just a few of those areas that we focus on. We're engaged in this work because we understand how much financial security and access to economic opportunity is a determinant of one's physical and mental health. And we approach this work with an equity lens, prioritizing support for entrepreneurs and communities of color, because we also know that economic opportunity is not equally distributed. Our internal work is focused on improving our hiring and procurement practices and using our spending power to bring more diverse businesses into the supply chain and hire more diverse community members. And the external work that I manage and that we're focused on here today is making grants to national and community-based nonprofit organizations that are doing this important work to reduce the racial wealth gap. Our diverse business growth grant making over the past few years has really been focused on strengthening the ecosystem of support for entrepreneurs of color. We know that entrepreneurs of color have experienced disproportionately low investments in their businesses, and also that Black and Brown-led CDFIs have also suffered from a lack of investment to support the infrastructure development within their own institutions. BIPOC-led CDFIs that understand and reflect the populations that they serve are an essential part of that ecosystem of support for businesses. Black-led CDFIs working in Black communities in particular are at the forefront of addressing those economic disparities. CDFIs were created to provide a fair and responsible financing in communities that have been historically underserved. And although there are many CDFIs nationwide, a lot of them, particularly those led by Black and Brown folks, are undercapitalized and need more operational support to increase their lending capacity. So we showed up to work with Prosperity Now a couple years ago and made a grant to them so that they were able to build the organizational capacity of the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs and help them to secure their nonprofit status and grow their membership nationwide, develop their communications infrastructure, and develop also a new scorecard to track the extent that CDFIs and other funders are advancing racial equity through their investments. Prosperity Now, with our support, has been able to build resilience for a cohort of 10 AAA member organizations through intensive trainings, one-on-one coaching, and peer learning opportunities. And this support has been critical to their organizational management, fundraising, and communication skills. We're really thrilled about how much AAA and their member organizations have grown in the past few years, and we're excited to see other funders coming to the table to support this work as well. We really want to encourage more funders to think about the importance of building up Black-led CDFIs, both through funding, but also through capacity building programs and supporting groups like Prosperity Now that are really helping to provide that additional support that they need to grow and thrive and serve their communities. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to this conversation.
All right, thank you, Avital, for your words. So, as always, if you know anything about Prosperity Now, we like to ground conversations in data. And so one of the things that I just want to talk about real briefly, because I'm hoping that a lot of you are people who have been part of this series from the beginning, I'm going to touch on this in a different way today. So we know that our economy is not working for everyone because it was not intended to or structured to do so. Households of color and those with low incomes have been excluded by design from building sustainable wealth, and they continue to face systemic barriers that prevent them from participating and benefiting from our economic system. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit around just some of the data. So the latest data confirms that the pandemic is only intensifying structural and systemic inequities. And even though we are moving into a post-pandemic era, the impact of the pandemic is definitely still causing some distress to households of color, and they are more vulnerable and at greater risk to social and economic impacts. We see that households of color are 2 times more likely to have zero net worth, and they also experience high liquid asset poverty rates than the white households. The rising cost of living is causing more households of color to be cost burdened, and this is for both renters and homeowners, meaning that they are spending 30% or more of their income on rent and mortgage. The systems and structures that uphold our economy, from lending policies to resource distribution and dominant narratives around wealth, have kept people of color from fair and full economic participation. Many cannot get affordable loans to advance their aspirations. And we all know that homeownership is a wealth building mechanism for many families with high potential of upward mobility and economic stability. Black and Latino households own their homes at 41 and 47%, compared to the rate of their white counterparts at 72%. Another wealth building strategy is entrepreneurship. And unfortunately, many reports find that Black and brown individuals experience issues with credit, startup capital, business development, and stabilization, and scalability due to the lack of access to capital, education, and marks. We know that, we see that 20% of businesses are owned by people of color. And we also know that that's not even probably adequate because of the fact that there's so many Black and brown business owners that have small mom and pop businesses. And so CDFIs are playing a role that goes beyond lending. They are providing education, they're providing training and access to resources. They are vital to shifting this reality for so many underserved communities. They also need more trusted capital and other support to fully provide the holistic support that their clients need. Next slide, please. What I also want to talk about is just a little bit around how the COVID-19 has impacted the nonprofit sector, which I think is very timely since we are having a conversation around funding and investment. So the Nonprofit Finance Fund 2022 State of the Nonprofit Sector Survey collected data, stories, and advice from over 1,100 nonprofit leaders across the nation about the impact of the past 2 years. Now, while this only represents a drop in the hat of nonprofits, it does align with what we heard from our partners when we hosted 3 listening sessions on what their experiences were. All of our partners saw an increase in service demand during the pandemic. And according to the survey, 67% of white-led organizations saw an increase, and 81% of BIPOC-led saw an increase in service demand. They also found that 88% of nonprofit organizations developed new or different services. And of those, 51% said that they think that they were going to keep those services. And so I think it also contributed to the fact that 49% reported that staff took on additional duties beyond their job descriptions, which also impacted the capacity that was put on the different nonprofits. Next slide, please. So this also contributed to some of the organizational challenges, like staff burnout, that so many nonprofits and CDFIs are experiencing, especially our small and medium one. This was true for 82% of BIPOC-led organizations. And we all know that the way in which the Paycheck Protection Program loans were deployed heightened the disparities felt by organizations and small businesses of color. However, CDFIs stepped in and filled another gap. Many of our partners' budgets doubled over the pandemic, and they were able to provide loans to clients that traditional financial institutions did not serve. The pandemic will have lasting effects on the socioeconomic equality of communities of color. It will continue to deepen the need for viable policies and solutions that create economic mobility and wealth building opportunities. Black and Brown-led CDFIs have consistently operated at the front lines of economic upheaval. Unlike traditional banking institutions, they are providing holistic support to their clients to really advance the financial security for communities of color. Next slide. This leads me to my last point. Before moving into our panel discussion, during the pandemic, funders of all kinds increased their levels of fundings to BIPOC-led nonprofits and CDFIs. They provided unrestricted, trusted capital that allowed partners the flexibility to use the funds as needed. CDFIs were poised to take advantage of diverse funding streams, but still, it was white-led nonprofits that benefited the most. We are at a critical moment as we move out of the pandemic. When our society is going through a collective struggle, we see more people and public and private institutions coming to aid. Well, let's not have that charity mindset. Let's continue to invest where it's needed most. Let's also not forget about the institutions situated in these communities, these disinvested communities. They are BIPOC-led, responding to an array of issues. This also means that let's look beyond lending and let's give our CDFIs the support that they need to be able to not only meet their clients where they are, but be able to go beyond that. So now let's move into our panel discussion, where we will hear from some of our partners that are leading by example. I would like to welcome Hamel Douglas, Managing Director of Harlem Entrepreneurial Fund and one of our partners, to introduce the panel. Thank you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
I hear you. I don't know if we see you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hamel Douglas. I am the President and CEO of the Harlem Commonwealth Council and also of our CDFI, the Harlem Entrepreneurial Fund. Before the panel, let me just set the table a little bit by talking about the difference between CDFIs and banks. I often get asked the question, what's different between what you do and what a bank do? And it's a very interesting question to answer. We both provide loans and do other services, but what I often say to people is the difference is at a CDFI like the Harlem Entrepreneurial Fund, the people are the algorithms. We look at people as they walk through the door and try to assess their needs and try to meet those needs on an individual basis, as opposed to just punching in some numbers into a computer and getting a number to say yes or no. So people are the algorithms. So today's panel discussions will dive a little deeper into the role that CDFI plays, talk about the limitations that they face, and the customers that we're trying to uplift to erase the wealth gap and serve our communities of color. The panel will be led by Eleanor Reed, and Eleanor is the Director of Development at the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs. And the panel will consist of James Walls, Senior Vice President of Programs and Initiatives at Mission Investors, Steve Glaude, President and CEO of the Coalition of Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development, and Rochelle Mears, National Leader for Economic Opportunity at Kaiser Permanente. So welcome, panel, and we look forward to an interesting and lively discussion. And Eleanor, over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you again for joining this session. We look forward to having an engaging discussion with our panel, and you are invited to, as we speak, to enter questions into the chat, which we will address after the panel discussion. But if you have any questions as we go along, as I said, please feel free to enter them into the chat. Thank you, Hamel, for the introduction of our different speakers on today, and we're going to get started with a question that will allow each person to introduce their organization and then share how their organization interacts with the CDFI industry. So we're going to start with James Wall, who again is the Senior Vice President of Programs and Initiatives at Mission Investors Exchange. And James, if you would just talk about your organization, take a couple of minutes, please, and then talk about how you work with or partner with CDFIs and your perspective on some of the statistics we heard today, and even the comments from Hamel about people being the algorithm versus using a lot of the demographic or other data that many traditional lenders use to make an assessment of whether or not they want to invest in a particular borrower.
No, thank you, Eleanor. And I just want to make sure, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect, wonderful. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. So James Walls, I'm the Senior Vice President of Program and Initiatives at Mission Investors Exchange. Mission Investors Exchange is the leading network organization for philanthropic impact investors, so primarily foundations. In my previous roles, I was at the NEKC Foundation and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where I led a number of investments in CDFIs. And from my perspective at MIE, what we really are trying to do is support our members. So we have over 250 members to take a more intentional approach when investing in all of their impact investees, but in particular CDFIs. So taking a more integrated capital approach. So thinking beyond program-related investments or other types of potential investments, but what type of grant support you can provide to your CDFI partners. As we will dive a little bit deeper into the conversation, grant capital, enterprise capital, long-term philanthropic support is necessary, given that for many CDFIs, as they are trying to work very close with their community, they need other sources of revenue and capital beyond just whatever earned revenue based off the loans. And so, we are working very closely with our members to kind of inform them and explain the revenue models for CDFIs. So when they think about their impact investment strategies and their grant strategies, that the capital lines up with the needs of their institutions.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Steve Glaudet, we'd love for you to weigh in on those questions. Steve, again, is the president and CEO of the Coalition of Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development. Please give us your insights and perspectives on the issues we face today and how your organization interacts and is connected to CDFIs.
Good afternoon, everybody. And first of all, just a tip of the hat to Prosperity Now and Kaiser for lifting up attention and focus on Black-led CDFIs. They are an emergent industry within an industry, and as a result, without intentionality and focus, they tend to not get supports as quickly. So I just wanted to acknowledge Prosperity Now. The Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development is the systems change organization based in DC. We are comprised of 95 nonprofits and 60 mission-driven for-profits. We facilitate and foster system change through policy, advocacy, research, and high-impact special initiatives. All the CDFIs in DC are members of ours, and as such, we advocate with our government, financial, corporate, and philanthropic sectors on their behalf. The outcome of having this type of advocacy platform, which I would say we observed and why it's necessary, is that first of all, we've just helped the entire ecosystem become more familiar with CDFIs and Black-led CDFIs. We've helped increase capital, operating support, but we've also helped by kind of focusing on public education and ecosystem engagement. We've helped our locality become more reliant on CDFIs. Now some of our CDFIs are actually doing fund management for local government and local government programs, as well as having a more direct pipeline of capital access to federal and local government, as well as some of our banks. I guess one of the things that I would like to lift up, as I kind of mentioned a couple of things that we've done, is having someone in a geographic area, whether it's city or state, actually focusing on the ecosystem that impacts CDFIs, particularly Black CDFIs, is really, really important because they don't have time to do it. When we embarked on and taking on some of these roles, roles that include, for example, we launched a online lending portal for our CDFIs called smallbizloans.com with the notion of giving them more visible access to the market of borrowers. We checked in with them and asked them, did any one of them want to do it first? And they're like, we don't have time to do ecosystem management. We really need to stay in our direct lanes. And so one of the things that I look at nationally is in looking at a city and how it supports CDFIs in general, but Black CDFIs in particular, is, you know, who's doing the ecosystem management that connects Black CDFIs to markets, to government, to corporate, to philanthropic, and so forth. And I would say that we honestly stumbled onto it, but we're finding that it's really highly embraced. We are in the process of incubating a CDFI association here in the District of Columbia that can help really focus on the needs of CDFIs, but also put particularly attention on Black CDFIs. So I would say that it is Black-led CDFIs are an emergent industry within a larger industry. We all know the data that shows the disparate access that they have to resources and to markets, and without intentional focus and someone doing ecosystem engagement, their path to financial stability as well as expansion will be more greatly challenged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. And the African American Alliance of CDFI CEOs would be happy to talk with you more about the work we're doing and how it can integrate with this challenge that you raised about the ecosystem management. So we'd love to continue the conversation. That's wonderful. Now we'd like to speak or hear from Rachel Mears, who's the National Leader of Economic Opportunity at Kaiser Permanente, and get her thoughts. Rachel.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's really nice to be here, and I spoke a little bit on Monday, but and you heard Avital's opening remarks, but I think we are always still a little bit. There's a little bit of like, why is Kaiser Permanente in this conversation? And we kind of welcome that because I think part of our goal in leaning in on conversations like this and supporting organizations like Prosperity Now and the Alliance is to show how interconnected health and wealth are and how much we all need to work together if we want to achieve kind of our shared aspirations of racial equity, racial economic justice, and health equity. So really happy to be here and excited for the conversation. I think from our perspective, we began impact investing in 2018, and we allocated a portion of our corporate. We're a nonprofit, but we sort of, you know, we were big enough that we are like a corporation. And so we allocated a portion of our corporate balance sheet towards impact investing. And so we knew right away that CDFIs were going to be a critical partner for us in our work. And to James's point, we don't exactly do PRI, but we definitely do concessionary investing. And so we've built a number of relationships, mostly with larger CDFIs in that space. But I think it also just really uncovered for us kind of the critical role that CDFIs play in communities. And as a health system, you know, we know that 40% of people's health is determined by the socioeconomic conditions in which they live, and another 30% is their behaviors, which are also influenced by the conditions in which they live. And so I think we've come to understand just the critical role that CDFIs play in investing in all of the infrastructure in our underinvested communities, historically underinvested communities. CDFIs play a huge role in investing in FQHCs, health centers, community health centers, in education, and of course in economic opportunity, entrepreneurship, and household financial opportunities and stability. And so I think we have also just come to understand the limitations and the challenges that CDFIs face and the inequity that exists that the other panelists spoke to. And so I think in 2020, we were trying to make some investments to support small business communities across the country. We saw how they were struggling, and especially entrepreneurs of color were not being served by federal relief programs. And we found kind of a collective entity that was serving Latino entrepreneurs, one that was serving low-income Asian American Pacific Islander entrepreneurs, but we didn't find kind of a formed collective that was fully established, that was serving kind of Black serving institutions first and foremost and primarily. And that was when we got connected with the Alliance, and we started talking with the Alliance and Prosperity Now, and we made this investment in trying to stand up that the entity and build a lot of the infrastructure that if for those of you who are on, Len Woodlock spoke about on Monday. And so we really believe in sort of these ecosystem serving institutions, and we really believe in the work the Alliance is doing and some of the counterparts serving other communities of color in the country. And so we want to see more of it, and that's kind of why we're here today and excited to support this conversation.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel. And we really appreciate the work that Kaiser Permanente is doing, and especially articulating or vocalizing the connection between health and economics in our community. So thank you again for all that you are doing. And now Susie Lee, who's the Program-Related Investment Officer of W.K. Kellogg Foundation, we'd love to hear your viewpoints and your perspective from the Kellogg Foundation and how you interact with CDFIs.
Great. Thank you for having me today. I'm Susie Lee, and I lead our program-related investing work as part of our impact investing team at the Kellogg Foundation. And embedded in all our work is a commitment to racial equity and racial healing. And we are focused on utilizing all of the tools across the foundation, from our core grant making to our investments in order to close the racial wealth gap and tackle a lot of the challenges that we have, that you all have articulated and framed up for us today. To date, we've made $270 million in impact investments, and that's a combination of a carve out from our endowment to make market rate mission related investments, as well as commitments from our philanthropic program budgets across all of our programmatic teams to strategically fund flexible PRIs, or program related investments. And our approach is really one that looks holistically at, again, the racial wealth gap and focusing on the needs of investees and partners, and looking to solve for the capital gaps and the resource gaps by utilizing, again, all the tools at our disposal, from unrestricted core grant support to support capacity building, to support innovation, all the way to, again, our commercial mission-related investments. And we can talk through examples as we dive into the conversation here, but everything from making a $5 million equity investment out of our MRI pool into Southern Bancorp to help them really build the capacity to serve their constituents in new ways, during the last financial crisis, to, again, making flexible, long-term, low interest, again, highly flexible loans out of our PRI pool, and complementing all of that with grant capital that, again, can provide the capacity that's needed for operations, for innovation, because as we know, the business model for CDFIs are often thin margins on the lending, because the focus is around making capital affordable and accessible to small businesses and communities, and so there's always that complementary flexible grant funding that we look to bring to our suite of support. And I know we'll get into more ways in which we support our investees and partners beyond capital, because the resources that we bring to bear across our network, bringing other funders to the table, bringing peer networking and learning opportunities, and also unlocking additional funding. We can talk a lot about events that we put together, bringing investors to the table, helping other investors get to yes. But really, our thesis is around rethinking risk and reframing risk to break down these structural and systemic barriers that have prevented the flow of capital to communities of color. And happy to talk more about that in terms of really we're trying to peel away this unconscious and conscious bias that is, again, inherent in the investment industry, and really help do this within our own practice, as well as help transform how other investors and other partners think about risk, and in doing so, unlock more capital, and looking to be as flexible as we can across our various tools. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susie. And it looks like your organization has really taken a multifaceted approach to addressing the issues of inequality, racial inequality that many of our communities face, and our CDFIs in particular face. And so we appreciate that. We also know that the Kellogg Foundation did a study on the impact of righting racial inequality and the impact on our economy of doing that. Is there anything there you'd like to share on that study?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, yeah, okay, sorry, I'm having trouble with this mute. We did, we learned from the business case for racial equity study that, again, the US economy stands to realize an increase in 2.7 trillion in GDP by closing the racial equity gap. And we see these estimates as simply a floor in terms of the economic opportunity out there. And that number could increase to 8 trillion by 2050 as national demographics continue to shift, as we heard earlier. And again, being able to help colleagues in the industry and really rethink the paradigms around risk such that capital can flow to these opportunities, and so that there's a more fair and equitable access to capital. That's really our lever. That's where we're trying to, that is how we're working and how we're looking at this opportunity.
Wonderful, thank you. Rachel and Stephen, we've heard what Kellogg Foundation is doing to partner in a more intentional way with CDFIs. As your organizations have invested in racial wealth inequality, how has your partnership with CDFIs changed over time?
I would say part of the strength of our organization is listening to our members as well as the community. Our value to CDFIs is that we can influence policy, we can influence practices, and frankly, because we drive the local district budget. So our legacy of advocacy work has been in affordable housing. We were the first city in America to create a housing production trust fund, and in the last 8 years, we've gotten the district to invest in over $1 billion. In more recent years, the CDFIs have begun to learn from each other, and we do that listening. And based on that, they essentially direct us to advance both policy and advocacy. One thing I would just say that I have found has been helpful in our role is the pandemic created some both new opportunities and new stressors for CDFIs. They were asked to do things very differently and maybe in some expansive ways. And what I'm witnessing is that out of that, new business models for CDFIs are emerging. In our locality, the most successful and maybe high impactful CDFIs, and most of them are Black-led, have changed their business model beyond lending. So we have one CDFI, for example, that just purchased our art center in Ward 8, which is our most impoverished ward, and they've retained the art cultural element of it, but they've also converted it to a business incubator and a commercial center. And so they're actually incubating the businesses that they now lend to as well, but creating a cultivation center for entrepreneurs to go from operating out of their homes to operating in a commercial space to moving into the midstream. So, part of what we do is really listen and help translate what they're saying of their challenges into what are multiple sector supports to sustain them and to grow them. And you all know the themes all too well. It's patient capital, it is operating support, it is market access. And the one thing that again I would offer that I see is really helping, and it separates, I think, some who are more successful from others, is everybody talks about capital, everybody talks about the need to aggregate it, and of course deploy it, because that's the main thing. But how people align, how CDFIs align to market, I'm finding is a really wide open avenue. And one offering I would make is that CDFIs in generally don't have the bandwidth to do market expansion. It's usually someone else focused on that, but they should align themselves. So I'll give you one really concrete example and quickly. We run a minority supplier program here in the district. We work with our area universities, hospitals, universities, health systems, and utility companies. In the last 5 years, we've expanded their procurements to over 300 million to African-American owned businesses in the District of Columbia. And there's some CDFIs that are hooked at our hip. And so as those businesses have to scale up because of these larger, they're right there already in relationship. And I'm seeing that others who aren't connected to that market expansion thing are sitting on the periphery of what is probably one of the fastest growing opportunities in the district. And sorry for that long answer.
No, that was great. Thank you for all the insight that you provided. Rachel, is there anything you'd like to add?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
No,
I was double muted. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a little bit on something that I mentioned in my opening, which is that I think, we are relatively new to both investment, impact investment, and philanthropic investment in the space of economic opportunity. I mean, we've been investing in conditions for health for a long time, but only specifically in this space for the last few years. And I think, so when we saw how unequal the distribution of relief was, especially to entrepreneurs in 2020, and we knew, we have 80,000 small business customers, we have 40,000 business partners as vendors that help us provide care every day. And so we not only saw the suffering in our communities, we also saw it in many of our business relationships. And I think we had to go through a bit of a discovery to understand that, what does it take to push down relief, but and any kind of investment, so that it gets to the institutions that really need it. And especially as a big organization like we're national, we have relationships in the community, but we don't necessarily have all the relationships in the community in this space related to economic development. And so we just had a lot of learning to do, and understanding that there were and discovering that there were these kind of networks that we're trying to build ecosystem support and sort of collective collaborative space for Black serving and other population targeted organizations. That was really exciting for us, and I think helped us to understand as a national funder and as a local funder, kind of how to work with CDFIs as more than just like banks, essentially, and how to work with them as really community like transformers. And in doing so, I think that it also showed us how we need to invest in some of the like programming that CDFIs are able to offer. So I think I heard some of the other panelists mention like operations. and general operating support to support CDFIs. I think one of the other things that we really have learned and seen is that a lot of these CDFIs are the first, they're one of the main touch points of these entrepreneurs to help support them grow their business. And so there's so much potential, and many CDFIs are delivering very effectively, like more technical assistance and that type of support to businesses, but they don't always have access to funding to support those efforts, and they don't necessarily have access to like tools that might help them, or example programs or resources that might help them do it better. And so one of the example investments that we made was we worked with a CDFI out of California that has a pretty robust programmatic aspect to their organization, and they're called Pacific Community Ventures, PCV, and they had developed this virtual one-on-one coaching network that could be provided to anyone, anywhere, and was based on a large and growing cohort of pro bono advisors that could support like web design, accounting, hiring, various just basics in terms of running a business. And so we supported them to scale that and to bring that as a free resource to CDFIs and other business support organizations across the communities where we provided care. And they formed partnerships with about 60 organizations across the country, many of them CDFIs, who could see the value of providing one-on-one business advising, but didn't have necessarily the capacity or the funding in their teams to do it. So just to make a plug for there is this like technical assistance aspect that either needs funding or connection to other well-funded resources that those CDFIs can leverage.
That's great.
And Eleanor, I just real quickly wanted to mention another very tangible thing, and it's some of what Rachel said reminded me. One of the things that we realized that was impeding some of what could happen between businesses and CDFIs was that we found out that many businesses did not know when or what to borrow or for what reason to borrow. And so we spent the better part of a year producing a lending guide for the District of Columbia, and produced a lending guide interviewing banks, interviewing CDFIs, interviewing other community lenders, and of course interviewing businesses. And this guide was something we kind of did on a whim, but it's really been praised across sectors as something that has been very helpful in creating more relationships between small businesses and the broader lending community, but particularly with an emphasis on CDFIs.
That's great. That's great. You all have presented some really wonderful ideas that others could perhaps in their organizations use in some way to address these various issues of providing loan capital, operating capital, as well as programming capital to CDFIs. So let's now, as we talk about the loan capital and even the grants that come along with that, let's talk a little bit about how you assess a CDFI. What accountability measures do you hold them to as you assess them, recognizing that there are some unique issues that Black-led CDFIs face that might not automatically be considered within the norm of traditional ways of assessing a CDFI to see if they can manage or handle the funds that you provide. James, would you give us some insight there?
I'm happy to do so. And I come to this question from the perspective of working with foundations. And so some of the things that I will say is what I tell my foundation members as they're thinking about assessing CDFIs. The first thing I always tell them is that CDFIs is a general U.S. Treasury category designation, and does not mean that every CDFI is the same. And so you cannot assess every CDFI in the same way. For example, there are some banks that actually are CDFIs. While there are community loan funds that are CDFIs, there are some equity funds that are CDFIs. And so the first thing I always try to tell our members is understand the organization that you're actually looking to invest in, and recognize that because it says CDFI does not mean you know everything about that organization. So that's the first kind of framing that we want to always have when we talk about investing in CDFIs. The second piece of it is understanding whether it's a depository institution or a loan fund, right? And when you think about a loan fund, there are key metrics that people look at. For example, net assets, unrestricted net assets, and that helps to determine the financial viability of the institution. Oftentimes, it always says that it should be at least 20% net assets on the balance sheet. Well, that's actually very difficult to achieve if you're not getting the right type of capital, especially if you're a loan fund where you don't have deposits. And so when I talk to foundations, I say, oh, I'm glad you're going to give $1 million, 1%, 2% loan, but what are you going to give in terms of supporting the net assets of the organization? Are you going to give unrestricted funding to the organization? Is it always going to be tied to programming, for example? Because disproportionately, CDFIs of color and Black-led CDFIs, when they receive grant capital, it's usually tied to something. It's usually restricted to something, whether if it's technical assistance, whether if it's partnership or it's programming. I always ask the question, what are you going to provide to help with the financial stability of the organization itself? And so those are key. That's a key piece of when you're kind of thinking about how do you provide capital. A second piece is on the back end. When you think about reporting, meeting covenants, financial covenants, and impact covenants, that costs money. And when CDFIs are being assessed, oftentimes when they're talking to new potential investors, and especially foundations, the first thing that's going to be asked is, can I see your annual report? Can I see your most recent impact reporting? All those things cost money. It costs money to hire people to do it. It costs money to have consultants to come assist you with it. It costs money to actually produce the report. So when you're thinking about funding Black-led CDFIs, the question is, are you going to fund them to actually do the evaluations that's actually needed when you need to have your reporting as an investor? Why that's also important, because you're trying to get other people to come in and support CDFIs, so other institutions. So you want to make sure that you're putting them in the best position to take on capital. Another factor that's also often assessed is who else is it providing capital. So oftentimes you think it's other foundations, but in corporate entities, especially post 2020, there's questions about our corporate treasuries providing capital. Are you getting capital from public partners? So municipalities and states and others. Those are other factors that are being assessed. And finally, I would say the total cost of your capital is a key factor when CDFIs are being examined. If you're getting higher rates, and right now with the inflation environment, this is something that foundations and investors need to be mindful of, that they cannot go up at the same rate in terms of their PRI rates, for example, or their concessionary rates, because the demand is there. I think it's more of a question of how do you support community institutions and CDFIs with actually even lower cost of capital. I would argue that if you really are trying to support institutions who won't be able to get the lower cost of capital from banks and other institutions, that is even more of the onus on foundations to provide that lower cost flexible capital and other concessionary investors as well. So those are some of the factors that are often examined by investors when they're thinking about the financial stability of a CDFI.
Yeah, that's great. You bring up a good point, especially as interest rates are rising. And in this environment, Susie, with the loans that you're making, including the PRIs, how do you assess CDFIs, or what accountability measures do you use? And then what barriers do you see internally to providing that funding in a more sustainable way or long-term way going forward?
Sure. Yeah. Just to build off a lot of what James articulated around, I think a lot of the financial metrics pretty clear in terms of trying to support our CDFI partners in their financial health and sustainability. So, for example, if equity is required, oftentimes we can provide some grant capital to build up the balance sheets for our CDFI partners. We looked, but from an accountability standpoint, I think what's most important, as has been discussed here, is that every CDFI is different, right? And especially in the smaller and the more, I think, deep-rooted in community and place-based a CDFI is, the more unique some of the challenges and dynamics they will experience. And so our goal is really to listen and to understand what those, sure, we have a set of standard metrics or standard goals that we aim, again, to support the sustainability and the scalability of these organizations. But at the same time, it's listening really carefully around what is a particular place-based challenge, and then how can we as partners help them be successful. So the metrics actually often look very different. We're just completing a 5-year evaluation of our mission-driven investing work. And one of the extraordinarily positive things is that we've got a lot of metrics that we have, but oftentimes they're very different across our investees. And so we try to simplify, and if and when evaluation is required, provide resourcing for that, but to ensure that what we hold an investee accountable for is appropriate to their particular place in the communities that they serve, and that we are contributing as much as possible to resourcing where their highest needs are. And oftentimes, really keeping everyone accountable around where are the dollars flowing to. Are these organizations, really able to increase lending to BIPOC-owned, women-owned businesses, higher than the particular demographic of a given place. And again, that's aiming towards closing the racial wealth gap, kind of as our North Star. In terms of sustaining it in the market environment, I love the point about interest rates. We've had a lot of discussion with our peers and internally around, well, rates are rising, and our perspective is it's even more fundamentally important that our low interest and flexible capital remains low interest, because again, our partners are getting hit from all sides, inflation, higher rates, everything. And that, we're not the Fed. We have flexible philanthropic capital. And so our PRI rates have always been in the 1% to 2%, sometimes 3% rate, very long term, generally 10 years. And so now, that 1% to 2% is even more valuable and even more important that it remain at that rate, because the delta between market and what we are able to offer is more substantial. I think in a low interest rate environment, it's more about, capital's almost a commodity at times, and cheap capital is available from other sources. And so again, it's more about the value added resources that we bring. But now we're seeing, again, we need to maintain that flexibility and the low interest rates such that our CDFI partners can on lend at lower and more affordable rates. I failed to mention, answering the last question, that one of the responses we've had in recent years is we raised a $300 million social bond such that we could increase our overall capital deployment by 50% over the last 2 years. And so that went out both majority in the form of grants, but also in PRIs. We were able to do 5 times the volume of new PRIs in that time period than we have historically. And again, a lot of that capital channeled towards catalytic resources for CDFIs. In terms of the sustained support, I think part of it is also just helping figure out the puzzle of all the capital needs and then bringing the right teams and partners to the table internally and externally. I think sometimes when folks work with us, we have so many resources within the foundation across our different program teams, across our evaluation and our investment side. And it's really a matter of, again, listening to those needs, understanding really where the needs and the gaps are, and then bringing the right tools to bear, both from our own foundation as well as our peers. And we aim to bring folks together, bring people along, get folks to yes with, I mean, one example is an initiative we're doing focused on the US South, where we are bringing together 20 institutional investors to really highlight the opportunities, the challenges specific to the US South, but also the great opportunities and the investment opportunities through the series called Reimagining Opportunities for Investment in the South, the ROI tour, where we virtually, bring our investment partners to Mississippi, to New Orleans, and we highlight, again, what have been some of the historic challenges in access to capital, and then what are the solutions that we're seeing, and where can folks partner to really, again, if we don't have all the ingredients and the tools, we can bring partners in and fully solve for that puzzle and meet those needs. And so we're really looking to catalyze additional investment, break down the barriers that others are facing within their institutions, and increase the flow of capital over time.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you spoke a lot about the partnerships you helped to form and establish. And both for you and for Rachel, funding is just a piece of the equation. A lot of the inequities that we see are driven by policy. What can funders do, and what role can they play in helping to support CDFIs advance solutions on the policy forefront?
Eleanor, may I add just one additional piece? And I just really want to second what has been shared by Steve, Susie, and Rachel about listening to CDFIs. I can't tell you how often we have to always take the conversation back when we work with our foundation members and partners of, do you know what the goals of your potential investees are? Do you know what those goals are? Because oftentimes when we talk about impact investing, the excitement is to scale. We want to scale. Every investment is about scaling. How much capital did you bring to the table? How much were you able to scale an organization? But sometimes that may not be the ultimate goal of certain CDFIs. They may want to reach to a certain point, maintain, be sustainable, and move forward, executing that strategy, especially a deeper dive strategy within the community. That's a different approach of supporting than if you're working with an institution that's looking to kind of scale exponentially over a series of years. So I just think it's really important for CDFIs to make it clear what their goals are as an organization. So as you think about your 5-year strategic plan and other kind of planning documents, it's important to kind of build in those expectations. So when you talk to funders and talk to potential impact investors, they understand where you're coming from and how you're approaching this potential investment from an investor. So.
Yeah, I think that's a valuable point. And I think all of you have mentioned in some way that the funding you provide really needs to address the need of the CDFI and its community because they know it best, rather than coming in with a predetermined set of or a predetermined program that you want to fund and then put that on the CDFI, and they take the money so they can and have a corner of it that they can put towards the things that they know they need versus trying to meet and fulfill the obligations of that particular program. So I think those are great points. Now, to the question of how can funders help move policy along in the right way to break down some of the barriers or things that are hindering funding opportunities for CDFIs and then their borrowers. What are some of your thoughts, Rachel or Susie?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think that, implicit in this question is, I think, the point, which is that especially smaller CDFIs and those that are who often tend to be those reaching our most vulnerable community members, they aren't necessarily invited to the table for policy conversations, especially at a federal level. And so there's a disconnect between the CDFIs that are often impacted by policy and their communities and the room where the policy decisions are made, right? And so I think a lot of our support and a lot of our focus has been on how do you bridge that gap, and how do you get the perspective and ideally the actual voice of especially Black-led CDFIs, but also, you know, Latino-led CDFIs, Native-led CDFIs, low-income API-led CDFIs. How do you get their voices and those of, you know, really unique communities that may not be represented, maybe rural communities or otherwise? And so we funded a number of efforts to do that. I think some have been sort of funding the Alliance and the work that Prosperity Now did with the Alliance and the Expanding Black Business Credit Initiative and a few others, Hope Credit Lab and some others, to really set a shared policy agenda for Black-led CDFIs and Black-serving CDFIs to inform engagement at all levels of government. We supported similar work and efforts on the part of NowCab, the National Association of Latino Community Asset Builders, and Capacity that focuses on low-income API entrepreneurs. And so that's one piece. And then the other way that we've done it is we've worked with, we've supported the work of a group called Small Business Majority, who really do have a lot of invitation to conversations at both a federal level and several strategic states like California. And we are supporting some work that they are doing to create these tables where smaller institutions come and contribute to the conversation and the perspective and really give constructive feedback and input to Small Business Majority on how they should be showing up and the issues they should be advocating for. So I think it's creating sort of shared policy agendas, investing in those ecosystem driving institutions like the Alliance to help champion those policy agendas. And then it's when you have access to the decision-making rooms, it's creating like a space and a table and a collaborative space where alternative voices can join in. So that's how we've approached it so far.
Great. And just to build off that briefly, I think, Rachel, you summed up so many of the approaches so well. And from the WKKF perspective, and we certainly support with grant capital organizations like the Alliance and OFN and others who are really championing the needs of Black-led CDFIs. But ultimately, we need the federal government and all of these, you know, we need the implementation plans for ARPA, Build Back Better, the infrastructure bill, you know, most recently the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, we need these policies to really reflect a lens on racial equity or the to recognize the historic inequities and the systemic challenges that are built into government funding programs. I think we're all aware of the historic, you know, really, you know, government-led in some ways. I mean, these are policies structured into the way in which funds have flowed out from the federal government. And I think the recent formation of the Treasury Advisory Committee on Racial Equity was a huge step forward, where really voices from, and if you look at the composition, so our Chief Investment Officer, Carlos Rangel, serves on that committee to help share and voice the Kellogg Foundation's approach to reducing the racial wealth gap, and to voice the work of our portfolio of investments. But also, if you look at the composition of who is on that committee, it incorporates leaders of, you know, BIPOC leaders of CDFIs, representing the needs again of these communities. And so I think the more voice, having that committee, I think, is a first step for the government to really have a body that can bring forward these voices and help inform policy, and also shine a light on areas where policies have been specifically exclusionary, and to really start to peel back those biases and ensure that the future flow of funding is more equitable. I think there were a lot of lessons learned, and when we look at the data around PPP funding and where it went and didn't go, I think again, having bodies like this Racial Equity Committee is a starting point to really ensure that that the right voices are at the table to help inform the flow of capital.
Wonderful. We just have a few more minutes before we go to question and answers, but since we're talking about how some of these government agencies can interact, I know that SBA has a roundtable they started. Our president CEO, Linwood Long, is on that roundtable to talk about how their policies can be more equitable, but in particular for smaller CDFIs, and a lot of them spring up because there's a need where they exist that is not being met by other CDFIs. And so how can these agencies begin to also incorporate making sure these smaller CDFIs get the founding that they need to really grow and scale and help meet the needs of their communities? Any of you?
So I'm happy to jump in with some initial thoughts and welcome others. But in my previous role at the NEKC Foundation, we worked really hard to try to identify how to support CDFIs in Baltimore. So there are a number of smaller CDFIs, but there are some larger ones as well. But in terms of small business, a lot of them, have smaller balance sheets compared to some of the larger small business lenders around the country. And one of the things that we did as Casey was, one, support efforts that were done by OFN and others to kind of bring them together. So to bring larger CDFIs and smaller CDFIs in the same room, for sure acknowledgement, which was very important for us. So that was the first thing. The second thing we did was provide support grants to smaller CDFIs, and we encourage our members, as they kind of think about their place-based strategies, to provide initial grants. And I would say that they're probably get to know you grants, but they're critical because it allows you to kind of build relationships with larger funders within a region, right? So, oftentimes, I think folks say, like, you should ask for the most money that you can when you go to foundations. I would argue the best approach, oftentimes, especially if you don't know certain foundations, is to ask for the amount that gets you a relationship with the funder. And that is a key piece to it, because you need to build initial relationships before larger funds will start to flow. So that's one thing that we kind of learned in Baltimore, was we need to bring folks into the room together, large and small, so everyone is at the table. The second thing was use the grant strategy from foundations to get to know who was in the ecosystem and what made sense for us as a foundation to think about larger investments. So just to give you an example, two of our larger are of these kind of like entry grants that we provided were, I would say somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000. But what those led to were multi-million-dollar commitments afterwards, after we were able to kind of build relationship. Now, that takes time to do, and I recognize that CDFIs, we don't have time for all that, James. But that is one approach that has been taken and has worked. And there was another question related to the ecosystem, and I will just combine them given this work that happened in Baltimore. Was that the onus was really on foundations to kind of think about this ecosystem work that's done. So Susie is doing that work right now in the U.S. South, and Kellogg has done it in a number of places around the country, including New Mexico. But it's critical for foundations to really kind of lead that ecosystem conversation because the convening power, or entities like Kaiser are extremely important to have an outsized voice within community to kind of start that convening piece. That leads to the public-private partnership conversations with CDFIs. That leads to national investors coming into community once they kind of see local funders working together on a particular issue. So, what I would say is that, really like reach out to like your local philanthropy institutions, your local corporate institutions, to try to bring them together around this conversation, because that can spark a lot of energy and lead to some of the capital scaling that you've seen in places like Detroit, Baltimore, starting in the U.S. South, California, New York, et cetera. But it really kind of starts from those initial convening conversations of bringing everyone into the room, both large and small.
That's great. Thank you, James, and thanks to all of the panelists. Steve, you wanted to weigh in on that? I think we had a question related to that as well.
I just wanted to maybe add to, maybe even push back a little bit. We lead that convening, and we're not philanthropy in DC. I think DC is actually fortunate to have an organization like ours because we manage multiple ecosystems: workforce, affordable housing, the CDFI space. I think we define it a little broader. And every community is not going to have a robustly engaged philanthropic presence. And so it's great when I hear Susie say we're working on the Southwest, because I'm assuming that if it wasn't Kellogg touching some of those Southwestern communities, they might be challenged to work exclusively in a local fashion. I'm imagining that. I don't know that for a fact. And I think it's a partnership. Our local philanthropy actually relies on us to identify and lead convening, and then they find ways to support it. So I do think, I just know every community does not have all of the philanthropic presence that might be needed to platform, and then it has to come from other places. Madam Chair, I will yield the mic back to you because I know you wanted to pivot us to questions.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for weighing in.
Madam Chair, may I respond to Steve, given that was pointed towards me? No, Steve, no, I 100% agree with you. Oftentimes when we think about philanthropic institutions, they come in and try to place their voice within the community, and oftentimes don't listen to who's actually on the ground doing the work. So you know, in Baltimore, I say it because I was sitting there in Baltimore. So I fully recognize and I agree with that point directly. And I think it's important for institutions to identify your organization or the equivalent organization or someone else, and then also bring that philanthropic voice to the table. So very much agree with you, Steve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to all of you for responding to my questions. And now we're going to shift to some of the questions from those in the audience. The first question, I believe Steve is going to respond directly in the chat, and that had to do with giving some details on how or what goes into an ecosystem management strategy that directly impacts Black-led CDFIs. So Steve is going to write a response to that particular question so that you all can see it. Our second question is, do CDFIs work with public banks? And if so, can we get an example of such a partnership, or how you could actually get such a partnership started? Anyone?
So I'm happy to respond to that. Answer yes, oftentimes, especially as you CDFIs are looking to scale strategies. Much of their capital comes from public banks. So, you know, notable examples include, I think one of the strategies and partnerships in Susie's portfolio, the Entrepreneurs of Color strategy, that was very much designed in partnership with CDFI and JP Chase. And that JP Chase strategy has become one of their signature strategies, where they are very much working as a public bank and placing capital with a number of CDFIs around the country. You also see CDFIs working, or larger banks working closely with scaling CDFIs. So for example, Goldman Sachs did a lot of investment and worked with Lendistry. So Lendistry, SBA, Lender, I think is actually part of the alliance as well. They scaled because of the partnership with Goldman Sachs, especially during the PPP lending phase or era. And so you see a lot of collaboration now from public banks looking to partner with CDFIs. It's always happened, but I think now it's much more visible and noticeable as banks realize the importance of CDFIs and putting capital within the community.
I think it's also much more intentional now, and so we're really seeing and hearing more about that. Anyone else want to weigh on that before we move to the next question?
Yeah, I just want to real quickly. There is another driver that is lesser seen. I serve on 7 bank merger advisory boards, so I'm a part of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition kind of community benefits agreement. I would call us a traveling roadshow, and many banks reach out to us in advance of their merger, and if they don't, we tend to testify before the OCC to block it until a community benefits agreement is in place. During that process, we talk about a vast amount of community need, human services, homelessness services, affordable housing, and more. But what I can share openly is that when those conversations end, what the banks veer into is what they know best, which is lending. So while we may talk about a $5 billion community benefits agreement, and that, you know, you would hope, you would envision that money would have some spread, what often happens practice-wise is that most of that money in the benefits agreement ends up going to CDFIs because they lend, and lending is what banks know. So there is an infusion of capital that is going. I think that we're in a really important moment in time where the CDFIs have to be supported in voicing their broader needs, because the fear, part of my observation, is that they're becoming more transactional than they or we ever intended them to be, even though they are a transactional entity. And I think that the demands of the community, as well as the opportunities, are suggesting, and was another question in the chat, is taking on broader roles. I think that is there are strategic decisions in front of the CDFI field broadly, but in particularly Black-led CDFIs, about what is their identity, what is their scope of service and impact, and what are their lines of business. And I don't think that it's going to end up what it originated is. I just see it morphing constantly in our work here in DC and some of my exposures around the country.
Interesting. Susie?
Maybe just to build off of this role of banks, I mean, I think it's wonderful that they are writing larger checks and participating. I think banks, though, on this topic of risk, you know, banks still want to be senior. They want to write a large check, but be senior and still manage their risk. And so we are often seeing the need for philanthropy and other more flexible forms of capital to still come in and provide that subordinated layer, de-risk a lot of the bank's needs, and you know, philanthropy is often needed again to support loan loss reserves or provide equity. And there's so many examples of you know, CDFIs who have multiple banking partners who want to write large checks, but they still need to have that de-risking capital to unlock those checks from banks. And so I think continuing that conversation to get banks to rethink risk and come in at different places in the capital stack can really be, because of the scale and those check sizes, I think that would be a real game changer for capitalizing CDFIs. But getting banks to rethink risk is is challenging, and it takes a lot of work.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. And so as we go to this next question, I think it still ties somewhat here. But as we talk about, and to Steve's point, moving away from being transactional and being transformative in the lending that's done, or even the grant making that's done, can you talk more about how you collect information on your outcomes and organize that data, especially as it relates to work that addresses racial barriers?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I mean, I think some of the things, we're about 3 years into the strategy that we had around supporting specifically entrepreneurs of color that involved a lot of what we've talked about today, what I've shared about today. And a couple things came up there that really feel transformational to us. I think one is, and Susie just mentioned this idea of CDFI's role in kind of de-risking. And I think there's something transformative about this idea of risk, and CDFI is really playing this role not just to lend to riskier borrowers, but to help make those borrowers less risky in the long term. And so that you have this kind of graduation from like CDFI capital to a different type of CDFI capital to ultimately public bank capital. And so we've been really interested in the issue of credit building and how CDFIs can play a role in helping entrepreneurs understand the impacts that their personal credit have on their risk levels, how to start to build business line credit, and how to make sure that we're separating the two and just getting much more sophisticated in that space so that entrepreneurs are really they're starting to look better on paper to public banks. And so that feels transformative in terms of really getting at the root of the issue, and CDFIs being a part of that solution. And so that's an area that we've been really focused in is how can we actually de-risk a lot of these entrepreneurs in long-term ways and not just give them capital right now. And I think that also speaks to, I think Steve brought up the point of like the technical assistance side of like, what kind of capital do you actually need? Like, what are you growing for? And I also think that on that note, like, we need to be careful and pay attention to like income generation of businesses as well as like business growth. And so that's another thing that we're looking at, like recognizing that especially for small entrepreneurs, this is really about generating income. It's not necessarily about immediately growing the business. And sometimes those two are related and sometimes they're not. And so how can we really serve entrepreneurs so that they're bringing money home, they're growing the business in a way that actually creates wealth for them, and doesn't create credit risk for them, frankly, and that we're really moving people into like the mainstream economy as much as we can over time.
Yeah, that's great. Susie, I have a quick question for you related to this because Rachel touched on the one side of risk, and that is de-risking the borrower. But how is Kellogg Foundation approaching the question of the risk of not supporting, especially Black-led CDFIs going forward?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of, I think we do it directly. So we are directly supporting BIPOC-led and Black-led CDFIs, but at the same time realizing that in order to do more of this work and scale up, there are also aggregation vehicles that we support to, again, bring this work to scale. I think we've historically, to date, we've invested, I believe it's over 50 million in almost 20 CDFI partners. And we would love to continue doing that work again directly at the smaller scale in all the places in which we are focused. But at the same time, we do need to look towards aggregation vehicles that make it more efficient, both for us as the funding partner and for our CDFI partners to, again, channel capital and resources more efficiently and effectively such that we can really focus on moving the needle from a systems change perspective. So I think it's balancing the direct and place-based and often smaller efforts with aggregation strategies that help to, SOAR is a great example of that, where partners like Calvert and LISC are really standing up, aggregation vehicles that can help smaller CDFIs with fundraising, which often takes up a tremendous amount of capacity, fundraising and marketing to businesses. So using a tech-enabled platform to streamline marketing, outreach, lead generation, and the early phases of the underwriting process, and then aggregating that fundraising and frankly allowing the smaller CDFIs to leverage their own balance sheets. And with an aggregation strategy like SOAR, they're able to on lend 20 times on every dollar, because SOAR is able to purchase the loans from those CDFIs. And so looking at scalable aggregation strategies, and sort of a both and of really continuing to in certain opportunities, continue to invest directly, but at the same time, as we move towards more systems change, looking at these scaling up or replication of aggregation strategies that will also take the burden off of smaller organizations. Because again, every small organization has to then build up a fundraise. There's just a lot that can be streamlined when CDFIs are able to collaborate and leverage shared resources around fundraising and marketing and outreach. And I think just around this broader conversation of how do we continue to move forward, sharing the data around, in fact, if we look at perceived risk at the time of investment or underwriting, and then you look 5 years later around what the actual results are of looking at loan loss in the portfolio, looking at the strength of growth of the businesses, looking at low failure rates, all of these things, and what types of technical assistance and partnership and services were the most effective in helping those businesses thrive. I think all of that learning will really help move the needle in terms of shifting from a perceived higher risk to a known, based on all the data that we're gathering from our portfolio of the actual risk was not as high as that perceived risk, and therefore future infusions of capital should be priced accordingly, and really will continue to move along that spectrum of getting to a place where perceived higher risk is no longer a barrier to the flow of capital.
Great, thank you so much. And we have run out of time for additional questions, so I'm going to say thank you to all of the different panelists, and all of your insights and information has been very beneficial. We appreciate your participating today. I'm going to turn it over to Ebony.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for that robust and just very full of a lot of good insight. And I appreciate all of you taking the time to be with us today. We are running a little bit over, so I'm going to move us forward rather rapidly. And so this is now the time where we are going to hear from some of our CDFIs themselves. We know that CDFIs, they experience different challenges and opportunities based on their size. And so in this next activity, we're going to have 3 conversations where we will hear from 3 different CDFIs, all of different size budgets, I will say. And what we're going to do is we will hear from each one to talk about some of the challenges that they're experiencing across things like some of the things that we just heard around being able to assess some of the unrestricted capital, as well as flexible funding models, micro lending, product innovation. And so what we also want in this conversation is for you guys to be engaged and to offer up some of your ideas in this conversation as well. So to get us started, I'm going to ask Willie Hill from the Greater Cincinnati Micro Enterprise Initiative to join me to talk about, next slide please, to talk about CDFIs that are small, and we are coming at this from they have a budget less than 1 million. Hi Willie, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
Great.
So, yeah, so can you talk to us a little bit about some of the challenges that you experience as a CDFI that has a budget under $1 million?
All right, thank you. And thank you to the previous panel. A lot of great information. When James was talking, I heard a lot of my organization in his words. So, we are a CDFI loan fund. We do have assets less than $1 million. We focus on micro lending, and the challenges that come along with that really is about understanding how to support startups better. The changes in the economy really show that there was a big gap in the support of minority, of BIPOC smaller businesses and micro businesses. And, we surveyed over 300 smaller businesses, and an interesting stat that came out of that was that over 60% of them had not spoken with anyone about their business or about the challenges going through the pandemic. And that was a little scary for me to really see that number. And so, while capital is an important part of this, being able to have capital, it's just that the capacity of our staffing to really go out and meet that need of technical assistance. And for me, coaching is more about coordinating the technical assistance needed for these businesses. So, getting them in touch with industry specific type of support in terms of accounting, marketing, that really allows them to be able to really focus on the two things that we really want to try to build our technical assistance around is about helping them create processes and efficiencies in their business. Because most small businesses are grinding away, they're working hard in the business, not on the business, and it takes away from their ability to make better decisions and be aware of better decisions or resources to be able to make better decisions in their business. So access to capital for us has always been a challenge. A lot of the things that were discussed in terms of the dollars that we've received, they are earmarked for a certain service, and that makes it challenging for us to build our capacities in certain areas. And we really look at it from two parts. Most of the funding that we have received, it had been for technical assistance or something specific in regards to supporting a small business. And a lot of it has not been has been for staffing and our ability to be able to spend time with the business owners to, like I said, create these efficiencies in their business. And so, the second point is that, the capital that we've received or the capital that we're looking to receive is to focus on micro lending. The CDFI model right now is about, borrowing more, becoming bigger, being able to become self-sustainable off of the interest revenue. And but if you're doing micro lending, that's a lot of micro loans to get to a certain portfolio size. And so there is a challenge there in terms of us being able to build our capacity, in a timely way, or the time it takes to build our capacity is going to be a little bit longer. And we just don't have the consistent dollars to be able to do that. And the resources to be able to support us are mostly just, I heard municipalities, some national grant opportunities. It's tough because everybody's searching for those dollars and looking for those dollars. So I just think that the model to be able to support micro needs to be relooked at, and it needs to be evaluated differently. Our products are not, where they need to be, and so that's what I think we're sort of looking for, more resources in that space. So when I look at when we're looking at trying to support again loan funds and smaller CDFIs, we're looking at products. It really is about trying to help us build our capacities and efficiencies the same way that I spoke about what we're trying to do for our business owners. I'm very grateful to AAA and Prosperity Now. They have really helped me tremendously from a mentoring and capacity building and helping me be able to make better decisions or figure out better efficiencies for me to be able to grow our organization. So I know we're short on time too, so I'll leave it there. But I do want to thank Prosperity Now, and I want to thank the panel. And I would love feedback or to hear feedback in regards to that.
Thank you, Willie. Yeah, so you mentioned a lot of things, and I think one of the things that I want to do is, well, what we're going to do, we're going to remix this a little bit just because we are short on time, but it's okay. What we're going to do is we're going to practice a lot of the things that was mentioned on the panel around listening. So we have a lot of people in our audience, CDFIs and other stakeholders, funders of all sorts. I want you guys to hear what Willie is saying around going back to one of the points that James said. Do you really know the client that you're trying to assist? And that you cannot actually evaluate and assess CDFIs all the same, because they're not the same. And so what we're going to do a little bit differently is that as we're listening to our partners, I do want you guys to still be putting in your responses to the chat. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for people to raise their hand because I do know some of my panelists or speakers, they do have a hard stop at 3, and I also respect all you guys' time and want us to be able to close out on time. So what I'm gonna do is, if we can go to the next slide, I want Willie to stay on, but I also want Kevin Holman, who's the Director of Program and Special Events at Beaufort County Black Chamber of Commerce, to come on too. And he's gonna talk about some of the challenges and how these things also impact CDFIs that have a budget between 1 to 5 million. So this is going to be a listening session, but I still want you guys to be thinking about a lot of the things that you heard on the panel, because to be quite honest, we heard some good nuggets on the panel. And I used to be a funder previously. I was at the Kellogg Foundation for almost 10 years. And so a lot of the things that I will say is built on relationships when it comes to really tapping into that unrestricted capital and being able to build relationships and leverage those relationships that you already have to really move your relationship where it's not so transactional, where you can actually tell them, like, this is actually what I need, and this is and it goes beyond the lending, right? And so with that, I'm gonna pause and I'm gonna ask Kevin to come on and tell us a little bit about some of the things that he has been experiencing.
Hello. Hi. I'm Kevin Holman, and I'm the Director of Programs and Special Events at the Beaufort County Black Chamber of Commerce. And actually, I just want to say, I mean, we kind of mirror everything that Willie said. We struggle with finding access to capital that allows us the ability to grow our staff in order to meet the needs of the community. And with us being in a small town, we have not established that municipalities or government here. So that's been a very big barrier for us. We focus on micro lending as well. $50,000 to $100,000 loans is what we focus on. And we found that our fight is really against predatory lenders out there, and also teaching the technical side. So we partner with like SCORE and other nonprofits that will actually help with, yes, we loaned you this money. We're not just letting you suffer or go through it alone. We are here with you, and tell us what it is that you're missing or the gaps in your plan, because a lot of us have great thoughts on business plans or business in general, but have not written them down. It's all up here, which that's great. But at the same time, we all need to be able to understand the roadmap in which you are following. So finding that time to do that, it's always been a struggle. And like Willie said, getting the access to unrestricted capital and being able to get that money to loan out there to people who qualify and at a seriously lower interest rate, or a lower interest rate, not seriously low, because we all need to make that money back in order to sustain us as well. So we all know that, but explaining that to the end customer or the end client is a big deal too. For some reason, it's a very untrusting entrepreneurial world that we live in right now when it comes to entrepreneurs, and especially entrepreneurs of color or minorities. It's very untrusting. So getting that trust and getting past those barriers are one thing that we focus on here.
Thank you for that, Kevin. While you were talking, one of the things that I was thinking about when it comes to really, accessing the unrestricted capital beyond the relationships piece of it is really how you talk about what you need, right? So how can you move from I need funding for a specific service to I need funding to support my mission, or I need funding to support a department or a portfolio, if you will. And I think one of the things that would really help in those conversations is to really understand what data you need on your clients to be able to pair that with the lived experiences that you're really trying to address. We know that communities of color have challenges that's beyond just the lending. And in order for them to be successful in not only getting the loans, but being able to actually maintain those loans, is actually truly beneficial for both parties to have those type of trainings and capacity buildings that you guys are doing. And also just understanding that sometimes it's about partnerships. Like Will mentioned, that it's about me connecting them to the right resources, right? So understanding that how can we position CDFIs who don't have the capacity, so you're not overworked, so you're not burdened, and trying to do everything for everybody, to really do an assessment of your ecosystem and see what partners you can really lean on that will, of course, mutual beneficial, to be able to help provide some of those resources so that you're actually able to focus your resources in a way that's more strategic and impactful for the work that you're doing. And I just want to just ask for my audience members and panelists who are still with us, if you have insights around specifically micro lending, which is just an animal in itself, please provide us some ideas, suggestions around how to really think about micro lending in a way, or what are some ways in which you have been approaching this in a way where it's not as risky for any of the parties involved. And so, Kevin, I want to thank you for coming on and talking to us about some of the struggles that you are experiencing. And I still welcome people to put some responses in the chat box for my partners that's on the ground doing this work. Now I'm going to shift us to large size. And so this is working with organizations that have a budget over 5 million. So if we can move to the next slide, we're going to have Justin Rogers come on, who works with the Greater Jamaica Development Corporation. Hi, Justin, how are you doing today? Oh, you left me. There you go.
Sorry about that. I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. So tell me about what's happening, or you're on the larger side when it comes to CDFIs, but you still have challenges, right? So can you talk about some of the challenges and really how they show up for you?
So our organization, we've been a CDFI for the last 40 years, and we provide loans in a range anywhere between $5,000 up to $300,000. I would say one of the major challenges is with restricted money, and or I would say government funding. So our CDFI, we are funded by the City of New York, State of New York, federal government, and then we have some private sources. The government sources are very restricted, and that really kind of, to an extent, holds us back as an organization. Usually government money needs to be leveraged sometimes. Government money also is very specific to a specific geographic area. And then also it's a lot of times it's restricted to a low income census tract. It just, in terms of personnel, it adds an additional layer. So we have some, and I'm not gonna be specific, but we have government sources where before we can disperse the funds to the individual, we actually have to do paperwork and get approval from that government agency. And not only does that take time from my staff, but it takes time away from the person who needs the funds. So I mean, that's been definitely a challenge with us. I have been here in Greater Jamaica for 16 years. I started out in terms of working with our CDFI. What I've been able to do since becoming president and CEO, which was about a year ago, I created a 3-person team internally here for our unrestricted funds. And with that 3-person team, it's myself, it's my head of my CDFI, and it's my chief administrative officer. We are able to evaluate a loan. And if we do approve that loan, we're actually able to disperse the funds via wire within 24 hours. And that's the kind of flexibility that you have if you have unrestricted funds. So that's with our private money, we're able to do that. Government money, there is no way we'd be able to do that. And I can tell you that the businesses love it. And because of word of mouth that's starting to get around, it looks like we will probably have made more loans this year in 2022 than we have ever in our 40-year history.
Wow, congrats.
Thank you. That's the team. They do a great job.
One of the things you hit on is how important it is to diversify your funding streams, right? Can you talk a little bit about what was your strategies and how you were able to diversify your streams to be able to even have your own team that's focused on really trying to bring in those unrestricted funding? And when it comes to unrestricted funding, what type of funders do that consist of for you?
Okay, so I answer the second question is very easy. So in terms of the unrestricted funds, we have some money from banks that provide us the unrestricted funds. And what happened is, initially when we created our CDFI, we only had government funding at the time. And the feedback was from the community was the fact that we operated like a bank. And as a CDFI, as everyone who operates or works for a CDFI knows, we're supposed to be more nimble and take on more risk than a traditional bank. So based on that, we had to find alternative funding sources to try to diversify our CDFI. It did take time, but I would say in the last 15 to 20 years, we were able to get banks to help support our CDFI. And like I said before, the unrestricted money, there's just no comparison. You can do so much more. I think that Chase was the first to, JP Morgan Chase at the time was the first to give our first disbursement of unrestricted funds 15 to 20 years ago.
That's great. Thanks for that. And I hope some of my smaller CDFIs are listening to some of the strategies. I don't know if you realize it, Justin, but I just kind of put you in a mentorship role for some of the 2 previous speakers. Yep, you're it. No, I'm just playing. So, another thing too that's really important when you're thinking about unrestricted capital, and I can say this as a former philanthropic funder, is that within the funding sector, we need to think differently around how we are perceiving unrestricted capital. I remember, looking at applications and really, and it kind of go to the, if you have unrestricted capital, then that means you're not doing, the money is not going to the work, because it's those short-term impacts and short-term outcomes that is the sexy thing to see, right? But at the same time, there's an overwhelming need for unrestricted, and I do see that our philanthropic community is seeing that now. But I also feel like on the flip side, a lot of the grantees, which I'm sorry, I'm using funder lingo, are the clients who would get these grants. They are also still very, timid when it comes to asking for unrestricted money because of that negative perspective that has been just situated around that for so long. I also just think there's a space for us to do some more narrative change around just unrestricted and really flipping that. And I think that would not only help other funders to understand just really how it really contributes to the impact that they want to see also, but it also just makes it easier for the ask, I think. Because I know a lot of times people feel like, especially in Black and Brown nonprofits, I can say this too because I worked in nonprofits forever before I was a funder. Like in the Black and Brown nonprofits, we want all of our resources to go to the work that we're doing. And we always don't prioritize what we need to do to really invest in ourselves. And so I also think there's just a space there for us to take more ownership in what we need to do to invest more in ourselves, invest more into our infrastructures and our staffing, so that we don't have things like staff burnout and such. And so as we close, and thank you, Justin, because I know we have 3 minutes left. And so I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm going to actually switch us out to our closing. But before I do that, I do have one thought that came from the audience. So thank you for that. One thought is to lift up small CDFIs, and make sure that they are building relationships within their ecosystem, as well as building relationships with larger CDFIs like AAA, NALCAP, LIST, that can also provide grants, loans, and technical assistance services as well. So with that, Justin, thank you. You're welcome to leave. I appreciate you. I just want to just thank all of our panelists, all of our speakers. I also want to thank all of Prosperity Now staff who have contributed to this series. This has been a 3-part series. The Racial Economic Justice team, my team, you guys are marvelous, and I would not have been able to do any of this without you. I want to thank Olivia for helping us on every single one of these and really helping to keep us in line. I also want to thank our partners and supporters again, Kaiser and the African American Alliance. And of course, this was all in partnership and support of our Building High Impact CDFIs of Color cohort. And so you heard from many of our leaders today, because one of the things that is very important to me is that it's not only about us providing technical assistance and capacity building, but we also want to make sure that they get the visibility, they get the access to partners and networks, but they also get a chance to be part of the solutions because they have solutions. So anytime we can use our national platform to create space for them to be at the table, to be at the seat, we're going to do it. I also want to just ask, and I want all you guys to do the same thing. As we talked a lot about just different various ways you can support them. Another way of supporting them is creating space for them at the tables that you are sitting at, because in a lot of ways, some of us are privileged, and they don't always have the privilege that we do. So please think about that. And with that, I'm going to close us. Thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be with us. I truly appreciate all of you and all that you do. Have a wonderful day.